Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the body for inviting me here along today. It's always interesting to talk to new groups of people, and for me, when it comes to things like surveying, I knew very, very little about it. As you heard, I had the benefit of having Mike come along and have a chat with us one afternoon. So I know a bit more about it now, but I'm not even at the level of being slightly dangerous. So it's a good opportunity just to come along by way of a slight sort of information piece, really, and give you an insight into why maritime security is important. That seems like a bit of a no-brainer, but also perhaps at the end what people like yourselves and the people that work for you can do to make it better. So first of all, these are the kind of areas I'm going to cover off. The first point, as I said, you could answer this for yourself. We all know, of course, it's got to be important, hasn't it? There is a backdrop to all of this, which is the complexity and the chaos that is around in the world. That's just a fact of life. It's not just maritime, but of course that's the sort of environment that we have to deal with. There are bits of detail that I'll cover off, but not in too much detail. Again, we'll just drill down a little bit more because the detail is important. It's the thing that drives the actions of the industry in general. And then I'll give you a little insight into how we do it. Other brands are available, so I'm not here today to talk about Dryad Maritime other than to use it as an illustration to show you the kind of considerations that we have when it comes to dealing with maritime security and supporting intelligence. And then finally, perhaps as what you can do, and we can leave that right to the end and to questions. I will take questions as with others at the end, and we'll crack on with the first bit. So why is maritime security important? And these are just two things that spring to mind for me. First and foremost, and of course the absolute principal reason, is because it's about making sure that crews are safe, passengers are safe, people involved in the maritime environment are safe, and there is all kinds of regulation that we know of to make that happen. And it's not just about criminality, of course. There are lots of other areas that many of you in this room, of course, are involved in, with health and safety and the sort of technical integrity of various parts. But keeping seafarers safe is a very important thing, and anybody who has reason to be involved in the maritime environment. You know, there is very strong duty of care that all have in looking after the people that are out there, be they seafarers, be they passengers on a cruise ship, or even people, supernumeraries that are visiting the ship for one of many reasons, and again relevant to this particular body. Secondly, the economic well-being of the globe, I guess. Global maritime trade, we all depend upon it. Here in the UK, we depend upon it in a big way. You know, sort of 95%, I believe, was quoted by the UK Chamber just recently of our goods and trade by sea. And of course, other countries who are not so dependent upon maritime trade for kind of imports and everything still need the benefit of it in order to be able to survive and to thrive. And in a nutshell, if people are going to prosper, they're not going to starve, and we're going to keep the lights on, then we need maritime trade. So it's very important that we protect those sea lines of communication that enable this. The strategic context, it is a complex, chaotic and sometimes dangerous world out there. I don't need to belabor this. All you need to do is just switch on the television this evening and watch the news, and everything from civil wars to sanctions in the maritime environment now, and to see some of the great tragedies, humanitarian, that are playing out before our very eyes. The news, terrorism and crime, lots of that embroidered into what I've just said about this complex and chaotic world. And the news and general media that bring this to our attention can highlight specific threats, but sometimes it can be a bit of a negative thing, in as much as sometimes some threats are blown out of proportion, causing untold concerns that then lead on to other things. So it's important to remain grounded, based on the facts and on the foundations that we have. But the threats that are out there, well, you could start writing a list now, and I guess by the time we've finished the end of my time, we'll probably just be finishing it off. But the big ones, of course, people are concerned about They were concerned about Somali piracy, a little less so now, more of that later. They're certainly concerned about terrorism from ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the likes. And then there are concerns, you know, the plight of the refugees that are using the maritime domain to try and get to a better life and escape violence, as well as many economic migrants as well. So just looking at a little bit of that chaotic and complex world, first of all on maritime crime. The slide that I have in front of you now is our 6-monthly statistics. So not necessarily completely aligned with the IMB or with any other body, because of how we do our figures is that we will look at the reported incidents, and if we believe them to be genuine incidents or have reason to believe they were precursors to genuine incidents, we'll record them. So we're normally pretty much there, but there will be differences. Now, the things to draw from this particular slide, and the numbers have increased slightly in some cases since, but I think that will suffice to look at the first half of this year. First of all, the Gulf of Guinea we'll take the rest of the world as miscellaneous, and there are bits of it all around. I won't go into any detail of that, but the Gulf of Guinea, strangely quiet at the moment, especially after the election of the new president, and it is strangely quiet. We weren't expecting it to be like this, and so much so that from the number 34 there, that was at the end of the 6 months, we're only up to 39 now, and we've seen very little activity offshore in recent times. But we don't think for a second that the threat hasn't remained there. Indeed, as you'll know, it's been there for many, many years. Somali piracy, the next number along where you see 4, that is broadly contained for a whole raft of reasons, from the naval forces that are involved in suppressing Somali piracy and the more proactive nature of their operations in recent years, right through to the use of armed guards on board ships, best management practice that's been engaged in by the maritime community generally. That has proved to be the right sort of combination of active ingredients for the medicine for tackling Somali piracy. That's not to say that the threat from the piracy altogether has gone away, but it is to say that as long as we keep doing these same things, we wouldn't anticipate a sudden surge in piracy again. And indeed, even the criminal infrastructure and the cash flows that feed this, and the logistics that allow the pirates in previous times to go out and get involved in open ocean piracy, they've all been badly affected as well. The figure for that, as of today, for Dryad stands at 10, only 10. And of those 10 incidents, if I told you that 9 of them were robberies at anchor at various ports in the Indian Ocean and only 1 was a suspicious approach, then you'll see my point about being broadly contained is correct. We haven't seen a hijack of a major merchant vessel in over 2 years now. The Smyrna was the last of those. And we've seen plenty of shots fired, but I'm afraid those shots have been from armed security teams on board that perceived that they were being approached by pirates and fired warning shots. We haven't seen any shots fired by any pirates for over a year now. And even then, close inshore in Somalia. We have seen some, what I would term as a little bit of fishing disputes. So some Iranian vessels recently were impounded, fishing close into Somali shores, but we haven't seen that threat against large-scale merchant vessels going through the area. Contrast this, though, with the moving across to Southeast Asia. I'm looking around the room, so I know that many in the room will be old enough to remember that Southeast Asia piracy, the Malacca Strait, we used to talk about that an awful lot in the latter part of the last century, long before Somali piracy kicked off in the very meaningful way that it did. And now that number is up to 173, so it's still going strong. It's an area of concern. It's a difficult area to deal with. If you are a small regional product tanker operating in the archipelagic region of Southeast Asia, and especially around the Singapore Strait, then you've probably got a greater threat and a greater risk against you than if you're a super tanker or a car carrier that's doing your normal business through that area. But there is lots of crime in the area, and regional forces are trying to get to grips with it, but are not doing as well as they might just yet. So that's the sort of maritime crime picture. Terrorism, well, this colour-coded map of the Global Terrorism Index sort of speaks for itself. The very darkest areas are the areas where there's the greatest amount of terrorism. You'll be familiar that some of these are landlocked and therefore don't necessarily present a risk to the maritime community, but some aren't, and concerns in recent times over ISIS maritime threats or the development of an ISIS maritime threat have managed to make it into the news. Sometimes in a very kind of exciting way as far as the media is concerned, that doesn't necessarily represent the facts about the actual capability. But there are many concerns out there about terrorism. Terrorism at sea is not as common as you might think. We can remember the USS Cole, we can remember the Lindbergh, we can remember a number of incidents where ships have been attacked either in port or at sea in quite a devastating way. But if you look at the numbers on sea, and of course we're in the right building to ask the questions, if you look at the number of actual maritime terrorism attacks, then they are a small decimal of a single %. But nevertheless, we have to make sure that we guard against such things. Where it is a greater threat, of course, is ashore. And I'm from Dryad Maritime Intelligence. Why do I concern with threats ashore? Well, for a very good reason. These are the guards that you see there are the guards that are based outside were based outside the Bardo Museum in Tunisia after the attack took place against cruise ship passengers. Not that cruise ship passengers were deliberately targeted because they were maritime. It was very unfortunate that they happened to be in a place where a terrorist attack was ongoing. But threats ashore don't just have to be a concern for cruise ship passengers or for holidaymakers. And we've seen some really tragic incidents recently, both with this event and, of course, again in Tunisia with the attacks in Sousse. But ships need to go into ports. Their crews, for various reasons, need to move ashore, be it that crew changes, be it for medical reasons. I guess, given the group in here, you know, when you've got somebody who's going out to a ship for an inspection as a surveyor or from a classification society or something, we need to move people through these shore areas, and therefore we need to be very much aware of the integrity and the safety of the pathway between the ship and its relative safety and the airport, perhaps. Now, for most countries and for the vast majority of the countries in the world, that's not a problem, but for some it is. And of course, when we do have other challenges, I mentioned the migrants issues or the refugees. Just showing one area that we look at very carefully, that route that's coming out of Libya and heading for Lampedusa and beyond. The vast amount of involvement of the commercial shipping industry here with because of obviously international law and regulation, where merchant vessels are being diverted regularly into assisting and trying to help with this humanitarian crisis that we have involved in saving people. Vast numbers of rescue forces in the area as well. But there's a lot to think about, and I think that this is, whilst I wouldn't characterise this as a threat, although some will if they think about associated threats that might feed into it, but it is a challenge nonetheless, and it is something amongst all of that complexity and chaos for mariners to think about. A little bit about Dryad Maritime. Mike has already introduced it to some extent, but we're a few pictures just to grab who we are. We're based down in Portsmouth. We have a staff of about 35 people, 35, 36 people at last count. 70% are a bit like me, they're ex-Royal Navy. They come from operations and intelligence specialisations. And so therefore they are mariners themselves. They have been at sea. They've operated in just about all the areas of the world between them. Certainly most areas of the world between them. Sorry, can I? It's a private company. It is, yeah. It's a commercial company, yeah. They've operated all around the world, sometimes in some very high-risk scenarios. And they understand the mariner. So when our guys are talking to the master or the officer of the watch of a ship, then there's an empathy and an understanding between them. We specialise really in managing uncertainty, and the people that we have, given the emphasis we've put on people who are mariners, are just about the right people to do it. And if you add together all of the service between the 70% of the 35 people we've got there, then we have, and I keep adding this up as we go along, we've now got well over 500 years of collective maritime operational experience that sits there within that building. So you can imagine that we can bring that to bear in whatever way is needed. There is a joke by the people that work in my department that half of those 500 years belong to me. But as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, by my face, there's no way that could possibly be true. So, a little bit about commercial intelligence, and to your question really, commercial maritime intelligence. Well, as you heard, I spent 30 years in public, 34 years in public service, 30 in the Royal Navy, followed by 4 years in the Serious Organised Crime Agency. Never did I think that I would go into doing intelligence, which is what I'd done for all of my career, in a commercial area. I knew that they existed, the likes of the big companies, Control Risk Group and the like, but I didn't think that I would be effectively in a company doing a very similar job to that I'd done at earlier parts of my career, looking after ships at sea. But commercial intelligence, so what's all that about? It doesn't replace what governments do. Governments have to do this themselves, but it's a question of scale and it's a question of priorities really. Just like I can't expect somebody to, the local constabulary to put a police officer outside the door of my house to ensure that I'm not burgled, then the profit-making endeavour such as the shipping industry has a certain responsibility to cover off its own security to a degree. You'll know that governments will step in, as I've already spoken about in the Indian Ocean, for example, and provide some sort of support there. But there is a certain responsibility that falls to the shipping industry to do this. We, with commercial intelligence, plug a gap. So to give that better level of detail, of knowledge, of education, and of coverage, and as you'll see in a moment or two. But I think one of the big differences between commercial intelligence and my days in the Ministry of Defence is that we're not talking now about very high-tech, very expensive assets, maritime patrol aircraft and the like. We don't have those. So we don't have high-tech assets, but we do have lots of assets, and you'll see in a moment or two just what I mean by that. And we also have privileged sources, so we have people that are in the community, that are in the know, that share information for the collective good, and therefore we can draw upon that too. So really this is how we do it. We do it through, firstly, the official kind of sources that are out there, so it would be daft for us just to do our own thing and not pay attention to everything that's already there being provided. We do have those privileged sources. We do have media and open source intelligence that we drill into. If you go and talk to the CIA and ask them what proportion of their intelligence analysis comes from open sources, you'll find that's a very, very large percentage, in addition to the niche and the very sexy and covert stuff they do too. So open source has its part to play, especially in the hands of the experienced analyst that can actually do something with it. And to do that forensically, to be able to drill down into things like the internet and to be able to find stuff in corners that on first look you probably wouldn't even think were there, that's where the real analytical skill comes in, and you'll be surprised at just how much you can get out of this. And we also have organic sources as well, and when I say organic, we don't physically own them, but our clients are in a position to provide us with information. More of that later. This is what we do, just like you, and any kind of professionalism needs to build foundations. So we need them. We need the foundation so that we understand the environment, so that we can detect the presence of the abnormal, or as they say, the absence of the normal. If we're going to know whether that instance that's being reported is a fishing fleet or a Somali pirate, We need to know what the sort of historic patterns are, what the capability is, etc., what the MO of the pirates are. And our analysts spend an awful lot of time doing and building this. We get into intelligence-led and risk-based planning. Well, we need to know what the intelligence tells us, we need to know what the threats are, and from that we need to know what the risk is. And one of the things that we find quite often is that people fail to make this distinction between threat and risk. An earlier example from earlier this year was concerns in the press over the ISIS maritime threat against super yachts. Well, having distilled and ascertained what the ISIS threat was off the North African coast, if you then looked at where super yachts actually deploy and where they do their sort of nice things, you sort of find that even if there was a threat there, that the risk of a super yacht encountering an ISIS maritime asset would be very, very low indeed. And quite often people don't distinguish between the two. But the risks are variable, and they're variable based on the characteristics of the vessels involved as well. A car carrier is going to be different to a laden supertanker. It's going to be different to Queen Mary 2 travelling at 25 knots and locked down, so to speak. So it's a matter of making sure that that all these things are taken into account, and then drilling down into the areas, as you see here, each country, each area, each maritime domain. More and more detail as you go down, and then understanding what the impact of some of these areas are. You know, what ports can you go to in the US if you've been to a country that's been affected by Ebola? What does a US Coast Guard list say about certain ports that don't quite meet their ISPS standards? So there are lots and lots of things to think about in all of this. One thing that we do think about all the time, though, it is multi-layered and context-dependent. This is just an illustration where starting at the top and working your way down, you start off with awareness and gradually move your way down or up in threat until you get to physical or armed security provision. And I should have pointed out at the outset, I'm not speaking as a company that is an armed guard company or an intelligence and operations company. But it also depends in what kind of area you're in, and they're just illustrative, and they are indeed dynamic at the bottom. Just examples. You've got to look at the environment. You've got to look indeed at other questions. So is what's your risk appetite? What's the risk appetite of the company? What's the policy, etc.? And indeed, as I said, what are the characteristics of your particular vessel? So it has to be looked at in that context. From there, once things are up in train, it's about monitoring, reporting, reacting. We do a thing down at Dryad, it's like air traffic control for ships. We have ships on our plot. If we see something that needs reporting, we get it out there quickly. We talk to masters. As a constant dialogue and proof of life of knowing where the ships on the plot are and what the situation is. There's just a quick snapshot of a day with a number of ships on the plot. And for each one of them, of course, they've got people on the bridge, they've got eyes, they've got radio, they've got radar, they've got communications. And bringing together all of that, if you could imagine drawing a kind of an awareness bubble around every one of these contacts that are all moving and going through certain areas, you soon build a very rich picture of what's going on. And they can be professional security people, such as the one on the top right there. They can be bridge crew and more bridge crew here. A great asset, really. Professional mariners, having those on board that are able to give you that kind of feedback, and having you there to allay the concerns and discern whether that is a fishing vessel or whether it is indeed a pirate that's doing a little bit of reconnaissance is very, very important indeed. And it's important to tap into local knowledge as well. This picture is a group of people who are on they're called an EZ course. It's something that the Royal Navy runs as I guess part of its outreach efforts. And they bring coast guards and people from all around the world, navies and the like, and they spend some time down in Gosport, actually the other, or Fareham, the other side of Portsmouth, doing all kinds of teaching and everything, and to get a little bit of an insight into commercial maritime activities, they come and see us. So as you can imagine, we try and grab the business cards, we treat them well, we give them our best biscuits and coffee. And we try and build relationships. but they are just, if you like, a snapshot of what we need to do in order to get that richness of knowledge that we're looking for. So I'd like to conclude by just 3 main points, really. I think we agree, I'd like to think we agree that maritime security is and its supporting intelligence, it should say, sorry, are essential components. It's all about lives, it's about well-being of all those engaged in the maritime industry, including surveyors. It does address a diverse range of threats. The world is complex and chaotic. It's always changing, and you know, if we'd been having this a year ago, some things I would be talking about with a little different emphasis. But be it ISIS, be it the civil war in Yemen, be it the containment of Somali piracy or the increase of Southeast Asia crime, it's always changing. And I'd like to sort of to end on the point that it's one of those things. It's a bit like security and safety. It's everyone's business. You know, from your own community, it is everyone's business. Everybody needs to play their part. Just like it would be incumbent upon you to report to local constabulary if you see crime being committed, then of course the same applies to maritime crime and maritime threats. And indeed, as professionals, I know that would be the case. And it's a question of just getting that fed into the right people. I think there's one thing that struck me from talking to Mike and from thinking about this body of people as a professional body, and that it's, if you've got one real skill, it's got to be that of observation. If you're going to be involved in surveying in whatever form, then it's all about having that sort of gimlet eye that can really be very observant and, as I said earlier, that can spot the absence of the normal or the presence of the abnormal. And my plea to you, in support of the well-being of the maritime community, and now speaking not as Dryad Maritime Chief Operating Officer, but as President of Propeller Club, and I hope there'll be some other members in here today, but speaking as that Propeller Club with its eye to the welfare of the maritime community, is say that you know, if you see something, let somebody know. Thank you.